She was sitting alone by the window when they started laughing. A plus-sized woman, quiet, head down, pretending she couldn't hear the sharp whispers cutting across the coffee shop like a blade. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Except one man. A mechanic with grease still under his fingernails walked straight to her table, pulled out a chair, sat down, and asked loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Mind if I have coffee with the most confident person in this room?" What he didn't know was that the woman he just defended was worth $3 billion, and she had been waiting her whole life for someone exactly like him. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started like every other Tuesday. Riker Hale was already running late. He'd burned the scrambled eggs, again, and spent 7 minutes hunting for Milo's left sneaker, which turned out to be under the bathroom sink for no reason anyone could explain. Milo had offered the theory that the shoe probably walked there on its own, which was exactly the kind of logic a 7-year-old applied to the universe, and Riker had neither the time nor the energy to argue with it. "Backpack," Riker said, pointing. "Got it." "Lunchbox." "Got it." "Did you actually brush your teeth, or did you just run the water and hope I wouldn't notice?" Milo's pause was a full second too long. "Both?" Riker grabbed the lunchbox off the counter, pressed it into his son's arms, and steered him toward the door by the shoulders. Outside, the Seattle morning was doing what Seattle mornings did in late October. Gray sky, low cloud cover, the kind of cold that didn't bite so much as settle into your bones and make itself comfortable. Their breath fogged in the air as they crossed the small driveway to Riker's truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked rear bumper and a heating system that worked about 60% of the time. The other 40% you wore your jacket inside the cab. Today was a 40% morning. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Are we going to be late?" "Probably." Milo considered this. "Mrs. Paulson gives you a look when I'm late." "I know." "A real bad look." "Milo, I know." They pulled out of the driveway and merged into the slow crawl of morning traffic, taillights blurring red through the fog. Riker had one hand on the wheel and the other around a travel mug of coffee he'd poured too fast and slightly spilled on his wrist. The radio was on low, some traffic report about a fender bender on I-5 that had already backed things up past the bridge. He switched it off. He dropped Milo at school with 4 minutes to spare, watched him sprint across the wet sidewalk with his backpack bouncing against his spine, and waited until the boy disappeared through the front doors before pulling away from the curb. Riker worked at Ballard Diesel and Fleet Repair, a shop owned by a guy named Dennis, who was 63 years old, perpetually suspicious of anyone under 40, and made the best green chili he'd ever tasted. The job paid well enough. Not comfortably, not easily, but well enough. Enough to cover the mortgage on the small house in North Beacon Hill that he and Milo shared. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to buy Milo new sneakers when the soles separated and decent groceries most weeks, and not great groceries some weeks. It was a life held together with competence and routine and very little breathing room. He'd been doing it for 3 years. Since Claire. He didn't think about Claire much before 9 in the morning. He'd made that a rule. The shop didn't open until 8, and he had 40 minutes. On the third Tuesday of every month, he stopped at Anchor and Grounds, a coffee shop on the edge of Fremont that had been there since before the neighborhood got expensive, tucked between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore, like something that refused to be gentrified. The coffee was strong and honest. The pastries were good. The space was warm in a way that felt accidental rather than designed. Exposed brick, mismatched chairs, windows that fogged along the bottom edges on cold mornings. He pushed through the door and got in line behind a woman in a rain slicker. The place was full. Morning rush, most tables occupied, the low hum of conversation and espresso machines, and someone's laptop playing jazz. Riker ordered a black coffee and a plain croissant, paid cash, and looked around for a seat. He found one at the counter along the far wall, between a guy typing on a laptop and an empty stool, and settled in. That's when he noticed the table by the window. There were 4 of them, 3 men and a woman, all somewhere in their mid-30s to mid-40s, all dressed the way certain people in Seattle dressed when they wanted you to know money was involved without them having to say it directly. Expensive fleece. Good shoes. The kind of casual that cost several $100s. They had the look of people who'd come from or were heading to something corporate, probably a meeting, probably in one of the glassy buildings that had started appearing all along the waterfront in the last decade. They were laughing, not the regular kind, the kind that was aimed. Riker tracked the direction of it before he understood what he was hearing, the table nearest the window. A woman sitting alone, slightly apart from the morning crowd, with a ceramic mug in front of her and a closed leather journal on the table. She was looking out the window, or pretending to. Her shoulders were pulled slightly inward, the way people's shoulders moved when they were making themselves smaller without consciously deciding to. She was plus size. Round face, dark hair pulled back loosely, wearing a charcoal sweater and no jewelry he could see. She looked like someone who had gotten up and come here expecting nothing more than a quiet morning and a cup of coffee. She looked like she was working very hard to appear unbothered. The group by the pillar wasn't being quiet. "I'm just saying," one of the men said, mid-40s, close-cropped hair, the kind of guy who had probably played lacrosse in college and still thought about it. "Some people really don't think about how they look in public." The woman beside him made a face that was trying to be sympathy, but landed somewhere closer to disgust. "It's a coffee shop, not a gym, but still, some self-awareness would be nice." Another man, younger, leaned forward and said something low that Riker didn't catch, and the group laughed again. The woman with the coffee glanced briefly in their direction, just a flicker, and then looked back at the window. Riker watched this. He felt his jaw tighten, that specific tightening he got when something was wrong and he was calculating whether it was his business. He was not, by nature, a confrontational person. He fixed engines. He drove carpool. He made mediocre scrambled eggs and argued with a 7-year-old about dental hygiene. He did not, as a general habit, insert himself into situations. But he watched the woman's shoulders, the careful stillness of someone absorbing impact and refusing to show it. The way her hand had moved slightly to her mug and wrapped around it, not to drink, just to hold something. Riker had a sister. He'd watched her navigate rooms her entire life with that exact posture. He got up. He was only half aware of deciding to. One moment he was on the stool, and the next he was crossing the room, coffee in hand, moving toward the window table. He didn't have a plan. He had exactly one thought, which was that no one else was going to do this. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up. Her eyes went wide. Not afraid exactly, but startled in the way people were startled when the world didn't behave the way they'd predicted. Riker set his coffee on the table and said, loud enough that it carried, not yelling, just not quiet, "Mind if I have coffee with the most confident person in this room?" It landed like a stone in still water. The table by the pillar went quiet. The guy with the coffee paused with his cup halfway to his mouth. The woman who'd made the face stopped mid-word. Riker did not look at them. He kept his eyes on the woman across from him. The whole cafe had dropped a half-degree in volume. People at nearby tables were watching without watching. The woman stared at him. She had dark eyes, brown, almost black, and they were doing something complicated, running a very fast calculation, trying to figure out what angle this was, what he wanted, what the punchline was. "I'm Riker," he said. Like that was normal. Like he sat down at strangers' tables all the time. She didn't say anything for a moment, then slowly, carefully. "Sabrina." "Nice to meet you, Sabrina." He picked up his croissant and tore a piece off the end, completely calm, as if he'd planned this weeks in advance and was right on schedule. Behind him, he heard one of the men from the group say something quiet. Then a chair scraped. Then another. He didn't turn around, but from the change in ambient sound, he gathered the group was gathering their things and leaving, which he thought was the right call on their part. Sabrina watched them go. Then she looked back at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yeah." He took a sip of coffee. "You're right. A beat." "But," she said. "No but. I just said you were right." She blinked. "Then why?" "Because I wanted to." He shrugged one shoulder, and because I was tired of sitting over there watching it happen. She looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read her expression precisely. There were too many layers moving at once, something like disbelief, something like suspicion, And underneath both of those, something that looked like it was trying very hard not to be relief. "You're going to want something," she said, not unkindly, evenly, like she was stating a fact about weather patterns. "People don't just, I want to finish my coffee somewhere warmer than that drafty counter." He glanced back toward where he'd been sitting. "And honestly, the croissant's better than it looked and I want to enjoy it. So," he settled back in the chair. "That's what I want." Sabrina looked at him. She pulled her ceramic mug closer. "You always this direct?" "Only before 8 in the morning," he said. "After that, I'm much more complicated." She almost smiled. It wasn't quite there. It was the territory just before a smile, the region where the face considers the possibility and doesn't fully commit. But it was something. They sat together for 22 minutes. He didn't ask what she did. She didn't ask what he did. He talked about Milo. Briefly, the way he always mentioned Milo briefly with strangers, just enough to explain why he'd needed to leave in a specific direction at a specific time. She asked the boy's age with what seemed like genuine curiosity, and when he said 7, she said, "That's a good age," and then caught herself, like she hadn't expected to say it out loud. She was guarded. He noticed that. Not cold, guarded. Like someone who'd had conversations go sideways enough times that she arrived to every new one with her hands already in a defensive position. She chose her words carefully. She watched his face when he talked in a way that was more than casual. She was reading him, running assessments, deciding how much was safe. He didn't take it personally. Some people were built that way by circumstance. When he got up to leave, he said, "Good to meet you, Sabrina." And she said, "You too." And he walked out into the gray October morning and got in his truck and drove to work. He fixed 2 turbocharged diesel engines that day, changed brake pads on a fleet van, had an argument with Dennis about the merits of a new diagnostic software that Dennis refused to believe could be better than his own 4 decades of accumulated intuition, ate a sandwich in the shop at noon, picked Milo up from school at 3:15. He thought about Sabrina twice, just twice, which he thought was reasonable. He thought about the way her shoulders had been pulled in before he sat down, and the way they'd shifted afterward. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who hadn't been watching, but they dropped maybe an inch. He noticed that. He also thought about the look on her face when he'd given his reason for sitting down. Not a speech, not a performance, just because I wanted to, and because I was tired of watching. He'd expected that to land as insufficient. He'd expected her to push back, demand a better reason, find the hidden motive that she was clearly looking for. Instead, something in her expression had settled, like she'd run the diagnostic and the machine had come back clean. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't do anything with it. That was the sensible choice. Sabrina Knox did not go back to her office immediately after the coffee shop. This was notable because she went to her office immediately after everything. She had, on one memorable occasion, left her own birthday dinner early to take a call from a contract attorney in Singapore. She worked the way other people breathed, continuously, instinctively, without much deliberation. Her assistant Priya had once told her that if Sabrina ever stopped working, she'd probably dissipate like fog, and Sabrina had found this funnier than she should have. But after the coffee shop, she sat in the back seat of her car and looked out the window for a while. Marcus, her driver, did not comment on this. He had worked for her for 4 years and had developed the professional quality of selective blindness. She thought about the mechanic. He hadn't known who she was. That was the first thing. He'd sat down across from her with coffee-stained fingers. She'd noticed, even through the initial shock, and spoken to her like she was a person who deserved to have someone sit across from her. Not like a prize, not like a challenge, like it was simply the correct and obvious thing to do. She'd been watching for the angle. She always watched for the angle. There hadn't been one. That was the second thing. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes app, and wrote his name. Riker. Then closed the app, then opened it again and deleted it, which was the rational thing to do. She was a 30-year-old CEO of Knox Systems, which built enterprise data infrastructure for 47 of the Fortune 500 companies, and had, as of last quarter's valuation, crossed $3 billion. She had been profiled in 6 national publications and 1 international one. She sat on the board of 2 nonprofits and 1 university advisory panel. She was, by most measures that mattered in the world she operated in, successful beyond the metrics she'd set for herself when she was 22 and building the first version of her platform in a studio apartment in Belltown. She was also, by the measure of having one single person look at her without a calculator behind their eyes, entirely broke. This was the part she never said out loud. The mockery in the coffee shop that morning hadn't surprised her. It happened, more rarely than it used to, but it happened. She had developed the city dweller's muscle of appearing not to hear. What had surprised her was the calculation she'd run in the moment, because she always ran it, and the fact that not one person in that room was going to say anything. She'd done the math on the room, and the math had come back as no. And then it hadn't. She stared at his name in her notes app for a long time before she deleted it. The following week, she went back to Anchor and Grounds on a Tuesday morning. She told herself this was coincidental. She was in the area. She liked the coffee. Both of these things were technically true and also entirely constructed around a third variable she was declining to examine directly. He was there. Counter seat, same general spot, same travel mug from home and cafe cup side by side. He was wearing a canvas jacket over a dark green Henley and had the slightly distracted look of someone whose morning had already required more problem-solving than they'd planned for. He was reading something on his phone and frowning at it in a way that suggested the news, or possibly a text message from someone difficult. She ordered her usual and, after approximately 4 seconds of internal deliberation, walked to the counter. "You come here every Tuesday?" she asked. He looked up. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise, or not entirely. More like recognition followed quickly by a recalibration. "Third Tuesday of the month," he said. "I come Tuesdays." She sat on the stool beside him because standing there felt worse than sitting. "That's a lot of Tuesdays." "I like the coffee." "Yeah," he said. "It's good coffee." They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind of quiet, which she hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with. "How's your week going?" he asked. She almost said, very specifically, "I am in the middle of a $12 billion acquisition negotiation that has turned into a three-way standoff between legal teams on 2 continents, and I haven't slept more than 5 hours in 4 days, but..." "Busy," she said. "Yours?" "Transmission swap on a '07 Kenworth. Those are fun." He did not sound like he thought they were fun. He sounded like he thought they were the opposite of fun. "And Milo, that's my son, decided this morning that he doesn't like sandwiches anymore. Any sandwiches. Including the ones he's eaten happily for 2 years, so I'm in a lunch crisis." "How old is he?" 7. "He changes positions on sandwiches roughly every 3 months. I should expect it by now." "What is he like instead?" Riker thought about this with more seriousness than the question probably required. "Right now, quesadillas, which aren't great in a lunchbox, but I'm working on the logistics." She nodded. "Thermal container?" "What?" "They make insulated containers, the kind people use for soup. You can do hot food in a lunchbox." She paused. "My housekeeper used to send me to school with leftovers in a thermos. I ate better lunches than everyone else, but they gave me a lot of looks." It was more than she usually said to someone she barely knew. She wasn't sure where it had come from. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't completely categorize. "Did the looks bother you?" "At 10? Yes." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "Now? Not particularly." "Well, what changed?" "I got something to do with my time besides care." He seemed to think about that. "That's either very healthy or very sad," he said, "and I can't tell which." "Possibly both," she said. He smiled at that. A real one, unguarded, the kind that had something uncomfortable in it. Uncomfortable in the way genuine things were sometimes uncomfortable when you'd been operating without them for a while. She looked back at her coffee. They stayed for 40 minutes that time. She told him she worked in corporate management. This was true in the way that technically accurate things could fail to convey reality. She managed a corporation, which was technically management. She watched his face for the calculation for the moment people usually performed when they tried to assess her numerical value. It didn't come. He told her about the shop, about Dennis and the diagnostic software argument that had apparently continued across 3 days. About how he'd gotten into diesel mechanics because his uncle had a truck repair place in Spokane, and he'd spent summers there as a teenager and found, to his surprise, that he liked understanding how large broken things worked. "There's something honest about an engine," he said. "It's either running or it isn't. You can figure out why. The problem has an answer." "Unlike people," she said. "Very unlike people," he agreed. She drove back to the office and told Priya to hold her 9:30 15 minutes. Priya did not ask why. She had learned not to ask why when Sabrina had that specific look on her face, the one that said a variable had entered the equation that wasn't on the spreadsheet. They met 3 more times at the coffee shop over the following 3 weeks. Each time was officially a coincidence, except that by the 3rd time they had both stopped pretending. She moved around her Tuesday morning schedule to arrive between 7:45 and 8. He stayed a few minutes longer than he needed to. Neither of them pointed this out. She learned things about him gradually, the way you learn things about places, not through description, but through accumulated detail. She learned that he had a working knowledge of Milo's entire social ecosystem, every friend, every conflict, every evolving preference, and held it with the same careful attention he gave to engines. She learned that he was funny in a dry, reluctant way, jokes that arrived without announcement and were gone before you fully registered them. She learned that he had been through something that he didn't talk about directly, but that was visible in the negative spaces of what he said, a hesitation, a way of not finishing certain sentences. She did not push. She understood negative spaces. He learned things about her too, she could tell. He was a quiet observer, Riker. He noticed things without making a production of noticing. She caught him twice tracking her posture when she talked, the way she straightened when she shifted into problem-solving mode, the way she pulled back when conversations got personal. He didn't comment on these observations. He just adjusted slightly in response to them, gave her more room when she needed it, less silence when she was spiraling into her own head. This was disorienting. She was used to being read wrong. She was used to being read correctly for the wrong reasons. People who identified her patterns in order to work around them, to get to the money or the influence faster. Riker read her and then just accommodated it. No angle, no extraction. He simply registered that this was how she operated and treated it as information rather than a problem to solve. She didn't know what to do with him. The 4th Tuesday, she arrived at the cafe to find him already there, but not alone. At the table beside his counter seat, a small boy sat with a hot chocolate and a library book, reading with his tongue slightly between his teeth. Milo. He looked up when she approached, assessing her with the frank and unself-conscious intensity that 7-year-olds applied to strangers. He had Riker's jaw and something else, something in the eyes that was searching and open in a way that was entirely his own. "You're Sabrina," he said. She blinked. "Your dad mentioned me?" He said he had coffee with someone named Sabrina who knows about thermoses. Milo said this with the gravity of a person reporting important intelligence. "We got one. It works." Riker, sitting beside him, had the expression of a man who had underestimated the amount of detail a 7-year-old retains. "School's closed today. Teacher planning day. He comes with me on those." "I don't mind," Sabrina said. And then to Milo, because she wasn't sure what else to say, "What are you reading?" He held up the cover. National Audubon Society Guide to Birds of the Pacific Northwest. "I'm learning all the birds," he said. "All of them?" "As many as I can before I see one." He turned back to his book, satisfied with this explanation. She sat down. Milo talked to her with the specific unself-consciousness of children, which was either charming or terrifying depending on your relationship to being seen, and she found, sitting there with a bird guide open between them, that it was charming. He explained the difference between a varied thrush and an American robin with the confidence of someone who had just learned this information and intended to keep it forever. He asked her what her job was, and when she said she worked with computers, he nodded seriously and said, "My dad says computers are fine, but you should know how things work without them." Riker, beside her, closed his eyes briefly. "Your dad's not wrong," she said. Milo seemed satisfied with this. He went back to his book. She looked at Riker. He was watching her, not with the calculating look she'd learned to brace for, with something quieter than that, something she couldn't name and wasn't ready to, but sat in her chest like a question she hadn't yet decided to ask. She looked away. Outside, the October rain had started. It came down soft and even against the glass, the way Seattle rain did when it wasn't in a hurry, blurring the street into watercolor. The three of them sat together and didn't say much for a while. Milo identified a bird on a page. Riker finished his coffee. Sabrina held her ceramic mug and let the warmth move up through her palms. She had 17 unread emails and a call with her CFO at 10. She sat there anyway. For the first time in longer than she could remember with any precision, she was not preparing for the next thing. She was not calculating distances. She was not waiting for the angle to appear. She was just sitting somewhere warm while it rained with a man who fixed engines and a small boy who intended to learn every bird. And something in her chest, something that had been tightly coiled for so long she'd stopped noticing the tension, loosened just barely around the edges. She didn't examine it too closely. She was afraid of what she'd find if she did. 3 weeks later, he asked her if she wanted to grab lunch, not coffee. Lunch, which was different. She said yes. They went to a Vietnamese place near Fremont that Riker had been going to since before it became popular. The owner knew him by name. They ate bún bò Huế and talked for 2 hours, and she told him more than she'd planned to about growing up in Portland, about her mother, about the specific texture of being the kind of kid who was always too much of something, too loud, too heavy, too certain of herself, too everything. He listened. Not the performative listening of people who were waiting for their turn to speak. He just listened and occasionally said something that showed he'd been paying attention and didn't try to reframe or fix anything she'd said. "You know what you are?" he said near the end of the meal. She looked up. "You're someone who decided to stop waiting for the room to accept you," he said. "So you built your own room." He paused. "That's not a criticism. I'm saying it like it is." She sat with that for a moment. "Lonely rooms sometimes," she said. "Yeah." He didn't argue with her. "I get that." The quiet between them was different now. It had weight. It had the particular weight of two people who had stopped performing ease and arrived somewhere closer to actual honesty, which was rare and more dangerous than ease, and they both knew it. She thought for the first time about telling him who she was. She didn't. She looked at his face across the table. This man who fixed large broken things and raised a son alone and sat down at strangers' tables without expecting anything in return. And she thought about what had happened every single time the number became part of the conversation. The shift, the recalibration, the way people's eyes changed when the value registered. Not bad people, not malicious people, just people to whom $3 billion was information that reorganized everything around it. She wanted to know what it felt like, just a little longer, to be Sabrina. Not Knox Systems CEO Sabrina. Not the profile and the valuation and the board seat and the cover story. Just Sabrina. Just this woman in a soup restaurant eating bún bò Huế with a mechanic from North Beacon Hill whose son knew the difference between a varied thrush and an American robin and intended to learn every bird. She told herself one more week. She gave herself one more week. That was how she knew it was already too late. The one more week became 2. 2 became 4. Sabrina told herself this was practical. She was busy. Genuinely, legitimately, not a pretense busy. Knox Systems was in the middle of a platform migration for one of its largest clients, a Seattle-based logistics company that had somehow managed to store 14 years of operational data in a server architecture that belonged in a museum, and the technical team was running on caffeine and controlled panic. She had a board meeting. She had a trip to Chicago for a conference she couldn't skip. She had 17 things that were legitimately more pressing than having a conversation that might break something she wasn't ready to lose. This was all true. It was also the longest she'd ever maintained a fiction in her adult life, and she was starting to feel the weight of it in her jaw, in the slight tension that appeared whenever Riker mentioned something about her work, casually, without suspicion, and she answered from the narrow corridor of things that were technically accurate. He asked once what company she worked for. She said Knox Systems, which was true. He nodded like someone filing information away and didn't follow up. She'd been braced for a reaction, a flicker of recognition, a recalibration, and there was none. Later, she realized he simply didn't track the tech sector the way people in her world tracked it. He tracked engines and diesel systems and fleet vehicle schedules. NOx Systems was just a name. She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. The lying, and it was lying, she wasn't flattering herself by calling it anything softer, had started as protection. It had stayed as cowardice. She knew the difference. She'd known the difference since about the third week. But the thing she kept circling back to, alone in her apartment at 10:30 at night with her laptop open and her second cup of coffee going cold on the desk, was that it was working. Not in a con artist sense, in the sense that she was, for the first time in a very long time, having conversations that didn't carry the weight of her net worth in them. Riker talked to her like a person. He disagreed with her when he disagreed, and he did disagree more than she'd expected, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never learned to be impressed by authority. He asked her questions that had nothing to do with acquisition strategy or market position. He wanted to know whether she'd grown up with siblings, whether she'd ever been camping, whether she liked the rain or just tolerated it the way everyone in Seattle pretended to enjoy it. She'd told him she genuinely liked it, and he'd looked at her with a kind of suspicious amusement and said, "Nobody actually likes the rain." And she'd said, "I do." And he'd said, "Prove it." And they'd ended up walking 2 blocks in a light drizzle without umbrellas while he listed every reasonable objection to rain as a meteorological phenomenon, and she'd counter-argued every single one, and she'd been laughing before she realized she was laughing, which hadn't happened in a while. That was the Tuesday she understood she was in trouble. Not trouble in the way trouble usually came for her. Deal-shaped, contract-shaped, something with a legal team and a resolution timeline. Trouble in the messier and more fundamental sense. The kind that didn't have an obvious fix and that she'd been specifically avoiding for 6 years, since the last time she'd let someone get close enough to rearrange something inside her. That time, the man had found out about the money 3 months in and changed completely overnight. Not cruelly, just differently. Like a filter had descended and everything she said or did passed through it and came out as currency. She hadn't let anyone close since. Until now. Which was spectacularly inconvenient. Well, the lunch at the Vietnamese place became a semi-regular thing. Not scheduled, but recurring. They ate at the counter sometimes, or got food to go and ate in Riker's truck because he had a lunch break with a fixed end and the sitting-down restaurant version took too long. She did not tell him that she had a standing lunch reservation at a rooftop restaurant 3 blocks from her office that her assistant had been quietly canceling every time she went to Fremont instead. Priya had not said anything, but the look Priya gave her on a Wednesday afternoon when Sabrina came back smelling like faux broth, that look was a full, articulate paragraph. "Not a word," Sabrina said. "I didn't say anything," Priya said. "That look said several things." "I have no idea what you're talking about." Priya handed her the afternoon message stack with perfect professional composure. "Your 2 o'clock has been moved to 3. Sabrina took the messages. At the bottom of the stack in Priya's handwriting was a small note that said simply, "He sounds different." Sabrina stared at it. "You have never met him. You laugh differently when you come back from those lunches." Priya didn't look up from her screen. "I have ears." Sabrina put the note in her desk drawer rather than the trash. She wasn't sure what to do with that either. The first time she met Milo outside the coffee shop, it was entirely unplanned. Riker had mentioned, offhandedly, that he was taking Milo to the Saturday market at Pike Place. Sabrina had mentioned, with equivalent offhandedness, that she occasionally went to Pike Place on Saturdays. Neither of them had proposed anything specific, and then Saturday morning arrived and she found herself there anyway, standing near the flower stalls with a paper cup of coffee and no particular agenda, and there they were. Milo saw her first. "Sabrina!" He said her name like it was a discovery, like he'd been looking for her on a list and found it. Riker, beside him, looked surprised and then unsurprised within the span of about 2 seconds. He had that quality, she'd noticed. The ability to recalibrate quickly without making a production of it. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. Milo was wearing a rain jacket that was slightly too big and had a small Audubon Society patch on the chest that Sabrina was fairly certain Riker had sewn on. and he was holding a paper bag of kettle corn with both hands and looking between the two adults with the bright-eyed interest of someone who found the situation entertaining. "We're getting crabs," Milo said. "Dungeness crabs," Riker clarified. "For dinner. He's been asking for 3 weeks. I saw them on a nature video," Milo said. "The crabs. I wanted to see them in real life before we eat them." He paused, apparently finding no moral contradiction in this. "For research." Sabrina looked at Riker. Riker looked at her with an expression that said clearly, "This is the energy I'm working with every day." "Do you want to do research with us?" Milo asked her. She looked at the boy's open face, the total absence of agenda in it. No performance, no assessment. Just an invitation issued from the simple position that more people made most things better. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." They spent 3 hours at the market. Milo performed his crab research with intense seriousness, asking the fishmonger several questions that the man answered with admirable patience. They ate clam chowder from a bread bowl, standing at a counter near the window, and Riker bumped her arm reaching for napkins and said, "Sorry," and she said, "It's fine." And for a half second they were both very focused on their soup. Milo ate approximately 40% of his chowder and then ate the bread bowl with complete commitment. And when she asked how it was, he said, "The bowl part is better than the soup part." And she thought this was probably the most honest restaurant review she'd ever heard. On the walk back through the market, Milo slid his free hand into hers, not asking, not pausing to consider. He was holding the kettle corn bag in one hand, and he took her hand with the other like it was the most natural logistical solution to having 3 people walking in a crowd. She looked down at his hand. Small fingers, slightly sticky from kettle corn. Something moved through her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not quite happiness. Or not only happiness, sadness inside it too. The specific kind that came when you encountered something you'd told yourself you didn't want, and you felt the lie of that in your whole body at once. She held his hand and didn't say anything. When they reached the parking level and Milo ran ahead toward Riker's truck, Riker fell into step beside her and they walked a few paces without talking. Then he said quietly enough that it was just for her, "He doesn't do that with people." She looked at him. "The hand thing," he said. "He's shy, usually. With people he doesn't know well." He wasn't making a speech about it. He was just reporting information. "I just thought you should know." She didn't answer right away. She watched Milo standing at the truck, pressing his nose against the window and fogging the glass on purpose. "He's a good kid," she said, which was true and also vastly insufficient, but she didn't have the language for what she actually meant yet. "Yeah," Riker said. "He really is." They stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before walking to the truck. Yes. November came in cold and sharp-edged, the way it did in Seattle when the year started committing to winter. The light shifted, lower and earlier, and the city pulled inward, the way it always did, trading summer's brief openness for the long indoor season. Sabrina worked. She always worked. But she started noticing the edges of the day differently. The end of the afternoon, when the office light went amber before going dark. Tuesday mornings, Saturdays. She and Riker had settled into something that neither of them had named, which was the specific fragile quality it had. She'd read somewhere that naming things gave them permanence, and she'd spent 30 years believing this as a business principle. What you defined, you could defend. What you left undefined was vulnerable. In her professional life, she named everything. In this, she couldn't, because naming it meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it brought the other thing, the $3 billion thing, the thing she'd been carefully navigating around for 2 months now, into the room. She'd drafted the conversation in her head 14 times. It never came out right. The versions that sounded like confessions felt melodramatic. The versions that sounded like simple disclosure felt clinical. She couldn't find the right key to open the thing with. Every time she got close, some part of her calculated the aftermath, the shift in his eyes, the recalibration, and she pulled back. She knew this was running out. She felt it the same way she felt market momentum. There was a window, windows closed. She just wasn't ready for what was on the other side. What? The situation she had not anticipated was Milo. Specifically, the way Milo had started treating her as a fixed piece of his universe. This had happened without any deliberate process on his part. It was simply the 7-year-old's version of logic. She was Sabrina. She was sometimes there. She knew about thermoses and bird identification. She held his hand at the market. Therefore, she was part of things. He texted her once through Riker's phone. The text said, "We saw a stellar jay today. It's blue followed by a photograph taken from the kitchen window, slightly blurry, of a large blue bird on the back fence." She had stared at that photo for a long time. She wrote back, "That's a really good one. Did you write it down?" He wrote back, "Yes, in my book. It's number 14. She'd bought him a proper field journal the following week, the kind naturalists used, with thick pages and a canvas cover and a ribbon marker. She'd found a bird stamp set online and included it. She'd dropped it off at Riker's shop on her way to a meeting, which was slightly out of the way, and she had not admitted this to anyone. Riker had called her that evening. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. He's been stamping every page. I think he's going to run out of pages." "I can get more pages." A pause. Sabrina. Something in the way he said her name. Not heavy, just present. Specifically present. Like he was placing it down carefully. "Yeah," she said. "I don't—" He paused. She heard him shift, the creak of what was probably the couch. "I'm not very good at this part. Saying things that are—" He stopped again. "You don't have to say anything," she said, which was what she always said when conversations approached the thing she was afraid of, her default evasion. "I know I don't," he said. "I want to." She was quiet. "I like spending time with you," he said. "That's the thing. I wanted to say it plainly because I don't think I have, and you probably deserve to hear it out loud." She closed her eyes. She was standing in her kitchen, marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, a view of the city at night that cost what Riker probably made in 3 years. She was standing there in cashmere socks holding her phone, and what she felt was the particular ache of someone who was, in this moment, genuinely happy and also very aware of the thing that was going to complicate the happiness, and unable to stop either. "I like it too," she said. "The time." "Okay," he said, simply, like that was enough. Because for him, right now, it was. She thought, tell him. She thought, not tonight. She hated herself for choosing the second one. "I'll see you Tuesday," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Tuesday." She hung up and stood in her beautiful kitchen for a long time, looking at the city lights, thinking about a man who said things plainly when he wanted to say them, and a small boy who had filled 13 pages of a field journal with bird stamps, and the growing distance between who she was letting herself be and who she actually was. She'd built knock systems from one laptop and a sublet desk and a credit card she shouldn't have maxed out. She'd made the hard calls. She'd been in rooms where she was underestimated in 11 different ways simultaneously, and she had held her ground every single time. She was afraid of a conversation with a mechanic from North Beacon Hill. Not of him, of what she stood to lose. Which was, she realized, the most honest thing she'd felt in months. She pulled out her phone and looked at the stellar jay photograph again. The slightly blurry blue bird on the fence, Milo's kitchen window slightly fogged at the corner. She put the phone down. Tuesday, she thought. She'd tell him Tuesday. She didn't tell him Tuesday. Tuesday came and went the way good intentions often did, absorbed by the friction of actual life. Milo had a stomach bug that kept Riker up half the night before, and he showed up to Anchor and Grounds looking like someone who'd been awake since 3 a.m, which he had. He drank his coffee in the particular exhausted silence of a parent running on fumes, and she sat beside him, and they talked about nothing complicated, and the moment she'd been building toward in her head, the careful speech, the honest disclosure, the things she owed him, felt wrong in the context of his tiredness. She told herself she'd do it when the time was better. She was running out of better times, and she knew it. The charity gala was Sabrina's idea originally. Knox Systems was a founding sponsor of the Pacific Northwest Tech and Community Initiative, a nonprofit that funneled money into digital literacy programs in low-income schools across the state. Every November, they held a fundraising gala at the Cascade Ballroom downtown. Formal event, dinner, award ceremony, the full production. She attended every year. She'd sat at the head table every year for 6 years. Her name was on the program cover. She had not thought about any of this when she mentioned it to Riker. She had in fact been thinking about none of the relevant details whatsoever. She'd been thinking about the fact that she wanted to see him in something other than a canvas jacket, which was a feeling she'd had for a couple of weeks and had not examined too closely. The gala had come up in conversation the way things came up when you were around someone often enough that your life started leaking into sentences without planning. "There's this dinner thing," she'd said on a Wednesday, eating sandwiches from a deli near his shop during his lunch break. "Annual fundraiser, kind of formal. I have to go, but it would be better with company." He'd looked at her sideways. "So, formal, how formal?" "Suit formal." "I have a suit." "Okay." A pause. He finished half his sandwich. "Is this a date?" She'd been aware of her heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. "Do you want it to be?" He'd thought about it, which she'd appreciated. The fact that he'd actually considered it rather than just deflecting. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Then it's a date," she'd said. She had driven back to the office running through everything that could go wrong with a very specific and catastrophic clarity. She'd called Priya immediately. "The gala," she said. "The Knox Systems gala," Priya said. "Is there any way? You're the presenting sponsor. Your photo is on the program. You're receiving the Community Leadership Award. There is no way." Sabrina had sat in her car in the parking garage for 4 minutes. "Okay," she'd said. "Should I be concerned?" Priya asked. "No." A beat. "Maybe. I'll handle it." She had planned, genuinely and sincerely planned, to tell him before the gala. She had a full 2 weeks. 2 weeks was enough time. She'd get coffee, she'd sit down, she'd say, "There are things I haven't told you about my work, and I want to correct that. And here's why I didn't say it earlier, and I'm sorry it took this long. And I understand if that changes things." Straightforward, honest, adult. What actually happened was that every time she built up to it, something flinched. A specific part of her that had been managing this particular vulnerability for a very long time went tight and quiet. And the moment passed, and she let it pass. And then there were 3 days until the gala, and then 2, and then the morning of. The morning of, she woke up at 5:30 with the full weight of what was about to happen sitting on her sternum like something physical. She lay there for a few minutes, running through it. He'd walk in, he'd see the screens, he'd see her name. He'd calculate the distance between what she'd told him and what was real, and that distance was going to look, from where he stood, like deception. Because it was. She got up and called him at 6:15. He picked up on the 3rd ring, sounding awake, but only just. "Hey! Hey!" She was standing at her window. The city below was quiet and gray in the early morning, the kind of Seattle quiet that only existed before 7. "Are you still coming tonight?" "Yeah, of course." A pause. "You okay?" She stopped. This was it. This was the moment, right here, 6 in the morning, with the city spread out below her and time still to correct the course. "I need to tell you something about tonight." "Okay." She opened her mouth. Her phone buzzed against her cheek. A second call, incoming. She glanced at the screen. It was Marcus Chen, her general counsel, which meant something legal had happened overnight, which meant the acquisition deal had moved in some direction it hadn't been supposed to. "I'm sorry," she said. "I have to take this other call. Can we talk tonight? Before the dinner?" "Sure," Riker said. Easy, unbothered, trusting in the way she no longer felt she deserved. "I'll explain everything," she said. "Tonight." She switched to Marcus's call. The acquisition problem ate 4 hours in her entire morning. By the time she'd managed it back to stable, she had 90 minutes to get dressed, and there was no more time for conversations. She sent a car for him. This was the first moment that should have told him something was different, and she knew it, but she'd told herself it was just easier. Parking was impossible near the Cascade Ballroom. It was a formal event. A lot of people used cars. It was a neutral detail. He called her from the car. "This car has heated seats," he said. "Most cars do." Not the cars I'm usually in. There was something in his voice that was half amused and half trying to assemble a picture from details. What kind of event is this? It's a tech industry fundraiser, I told you. You said dinner thing. It's a formal dinner thing. A pause. Sabrina? I'll explain everything when I see you, I promise. She was standing in the lobby of her building in a burgundy dress that had cost more than his monthly truck payment, and she was aware of this, and she was aware that she'd been making choices for 2 months that all pointed in the same direction, and the direction was here. He arrived. She watched him come through the lobby doors and felt 2 things simultaneously. The simple, unfiltered fact that he looked good. Dark suit, white shirt, the kind of uncomfortable posture of a man who wore suits infrequently and knew it. And the specific sick dread of someone watching a thing approach that they set in motion and cannot now stop. He saw her and crossed the lobby. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her for a moment in the way that people looked at things that landed differently than expected. You look, he started. Thank you. She said it quickly, before he could finish the sentence, because she needed to get through the next 30 seconds. Riker, I need to tell you something before we go in. But they were already outside and the car was waiting, and somehow they were moving, and the moment folded into logistics, the way moments did in crowds and motion, and she told herself, inside, before the program starts, she'd find him and she'd tell him. The Cascade Ballroom was the kind of room that was built to impress. High ceilings with industrial lighting softened to warm gold. Long tables with white linen. A stage at the far end with a podium and a backdrop bearing the initiative's logo. 600 people. The specific hum of a room full of the Pacific Northwest tech industry, which meant expensive quiet clothes and the practiced socializing of people who'd learned to work rooms as a professional skill. Riker walked in beside her, and she felt, rather than saw, the moment it registered on him. The scale. The density of money in the room. It wasn't his world, and he knew immediately that it wasn't his world. And she watched him absorb this and keep moving anyway, with the particular quiet dignity of someone who didn't panic in unfamiliar territory. She should have said something then. They were barely 20 feet inside when a woman intercepted them. Caroline Marsh, COO of a cybersecurity firm. Someone Sabrina had known for 5 years. Sabrina! She embraced Sabrina with the air kiss efficiency of people who did air kisses professionally. You look phenomenal. Are you ready for the award? Riker beside her went very still. Marcus needs you at the sponsor table before the program, Caroline continued, already half turning toward someone else. Oh, and they updated the screen display. Your company profile is on the main boards now. Have you seen it? She was gone before Sabrina could respond to any of it. Sabrina turned to Riker. His face was doing something careful, contained. Award, he said. I was going to explain, and the company profile. His voice was level, not angry yet. Processing. On the boards. Riker, what company? He asked. Quietly, directly. She met his eyes. Knox Systems. Something shifted in his face. A recognition, not of the name specifically, but of the weight of the name, the way it sat in this room, the way Caroline had said your company profile. You own it, he said. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment, not speaking. His jaw had that tight quality it got when he was working something through. Then he looked away, around the room, at the 600 people, at the sponsors table, at the scale of the things she'd brought him into without warning. Okay, he said, low and controlled. How big? She held his gaze. 3 billion, approximately. Last valuation. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. I was going to tell you, she said. I should have told you weeks ago, I know that. I was going to tell you tonight before we came in. I tried to tell you this morning. But you didn't. No. He nodded slowly. Not agreeing, just processing. He was looking at the room again, not at her. The light shifted. On the far wall, one of the large display screens blinked to the event program. And there, the sponsorship panel, cycling through the evening's major contributors. Knox Systems, her company logo. And beside it, a photograph from a magazine profile, the kind of photo that communicated everything at once. Her name, her title, the building behind her that her company owned. He He saw it. She watched him see it. She watched his face run through several things very quickly and then go still. Then something else happened. On the other side of the room, she could see a cluster of people near the bar. Tech executives, most of whom she recognized, a few she actively disliked. One of them was Derek Paulson, who ran a venture firm that had tried and failed to acquire Knox Systems twice and who had never been gracious about the failure. She could hear, in the gap between the ambient crowd noise, the particular carrying quality of a voice that didn't care who heard. "Heard she actually brought someone," Derek's voice. "Like a date. A laugh from someone. Is this another one of her little experiments? Bit on brand for her, isn't it? Find someone suitably unlikely and bring them to industry events so everyone talks about how relatable she is." Another laugh. A woman's voice. "Marketing genius, honestly." "Or just lonely," Derek said. Same result. Riker heard it. She knew because of the precise moment his posture changed. Not dramatically. Not a flinch. Not a visible reaction. Just something that left his face. The careful openness he'd had when they walked in. The willingness to be in a room that wasn't his. That left. He looked at her. And she saw it happen. The thing she'd been afraid of for 2 months. Not anger. Worse than anger. The look of someone who had run a calculation and arrived at a number they hadn't expected. The look of someone trying to determine which of the things they believed about the last 2 months were still standing. "Riker, excuse me a minute," he said. He walked away. Not fast. Not making a scene. Just walked. Through the crowd toward the side of the room and then toward the lobby doors, and she stood there watching him go and didn't move for 3 full seconds before she started after him. She was stopped twice, once by a board member who needed to confirm seating, once by the event coordinator who needed her signature on something that apparently could not wait. Each time she tried to keep moving, and each time the machinery of the event folded around her, because this was her event, and her name was on the back of it, and she couldn't make herself invisible inside it. By the time she reached the lobby, he was outside. She pushed through the door into the cold night air and found him standing on the wide front steps, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the street below. Downtown Seattle hummed around him. Traffic noise, the distant sound of the waterfront, the yellow glow of streetlights. He had his back to her. "Riker." He turned. His face had the quality of someone who had made a decision and was standing behind it. "Were you laughing?" he asked. "With them. Is that what the last 2 months were?" "No." The word came out hard and fast because it was the truest thing she'd said all evening. "Absolutely not. Because that's what it looks like from here." His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Something that was not anger so much as a deeper, older hurt. The kind that came from a specific direction. "It looks like I was something you were doing. An experiment. A story. That is not what happened. You hid $3 billion from me for 2 months. I hid that I had money, because every time anyone has known about the money..." She stopped. Tried again. "I wasn't running an experiment. I was trying to find out what it felt like to have one conversation that didn't have a price tag on it." He looked at her steadily. "So you used me to feel normal." It landed exactly where he'd aimed it. She wanted to argue with it. She stood there in the cold in her burgundy dress, and she tried to find the counter, and she couldn't, because he wasn't entirely wrong. That was the thing. He wasn't entirely wrong, and she knew it, and the fact that her reasons were real and her feelings were real didn't fully cancel the fact that she'd made a choice every week for 2 months, and the choice had always been, not yet, not yet, not yet. "I was afraid," she said. "That's not an excuse. It's what's true." "Afraid of what?" "Of you looking at me differently." Her voice came out less steady than she wanted. "It happens every time. And I didn't want it to happen with you." Something in his face shifted. A brief internal movement, something that wasn't hard anymore. But he pulled it back. "I have a son," he said. "He made you a bird list. He holds your hand in public. He trusts people about once every 3 years, and he trusted you, and..." He stopped, ran a hand over his jaw. "I needed to know who you were. That's not about money. That's basic." "I know." "Do you?" He looked at her. "Because from where I'm standing, You decided what I got to know and didn't get to know for 2 months. And now I'm standing outside a ballroom where half the people in that room apparently know something about you that I didn't. And I'm the one who looks like an idiot. You don't look... I feel like one. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly. It was the most unguarded thing she'd heard from him, and it cut her exactly because of that. And I don't usually let myself feel like an idiot. I'm careful about that. I've had to be careful about that. The last sentence carried something specific. She heard it. She wanted to ask. She wanted to reach for it, the thing he'd just half said, the shadow of a history he'd never told her. She didn't. She'd used up her standing to ask him for things tonight. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he looked at the street. I need to go, he said. Riker, not tonight. He said it without heat, just definitively. Not tonight. He walked down the steps. She watched him reach the street, flag a cab with the economical gesture of someone who hadn't planned to need one, and get in. The cab pulled into traffic and disappeared around the corner, and she stood there on the steps of the Cascade Ballroom in the cold, in a dress she'd bought for this evening, with 600 people inside waiting for her. She stood there for a long time. Then she went back inside because the thing about being Sabrina Knox was that the event went on, and her name was on it, and it went on. She accepted her award an hour later. She said her prepared remarks about community and investment and the importance of equitable access to technology. She thanked the right people. She smiled at the right moments. She was, by every external measure, composed and present and exactly where she was supposed to be. Priya, seated 2 chairs to her left, watched her with the careful eyes of someone who understood precisely what composed and present was costing tonight. Sabrina did not look at the empty seat she'd saved at her table. She looked at it once, by accident, near the end of the evening, and looked away again immediately and picked up her water glass and held it for a moment before putting it back down. On the ride home, she sat in the back of the car and didn't do anything, didn't check her phone, didn't open her laptop, didn't manage anything. She just sat there, watching the city move past the window. Lit windows, wet streets, the ordinary beautiful indifference of a city that didn't know or care what had just happened on those steps. She thought about something Milo had said at the market, standing at the fish counter, watching the Dungeness crabs with enormous seriousness. How do they know where to go? He'd asked. What do you mean? Riker had said. Like, in the ocean. How do they know which way is home? Riker had thought about it. I think they just know. Something in them knows. Milo had considered this. What if they get lost? Then they figure it out, Riker had said. They're pretty tough. Sabrina stared out the window at the city and thought about crabs finding their way home, and about a man who said things plainly when he wanted to say them, and about a boy with bird stamps who held hands in crowds. And she felt, in the specific way that people felt things when the consequences of their choices arrived fully formed, the weight of what she'd allowed herself to lose. She just wasn't sure yet whether it was gone. The days after the gala had a specific texture. Riker knew this texture. He'd felt it before, not often, but enough times to recognize it. It was the texture of a thing that had seemed solid turning out to have been hollow in a way you hadn't checked for, and you were now conducting a retroactive inventory of everything you'd built on top of it. He went to work. He fixed things. He made Milo's lunches in the thermal container and got him to school on time, and argued with Dennis about 2 separate diagnostic issues, and ate a sandwich at noon and picked Milo up at 3:15. He did all the things the day required of him, and he did them competently, because competence was the thing he'd always been able to count on when everything else was uncertain. But he was quiet in the way that wasn't his usual quiet. Milo noticed on the second day. Milo noticed most things, which was both the gift and the challenge of raising a child who paid close attention to the world. He noticed the stellar jays. He noticed when the milk was from a different brand. He noticed when his father's silences had different qualities, because he'd been living inside those silences his whole life and had learned to read them the way some kids learn to read weather. He didn't say anything directly. He was 7, not oblivious. He understood that some things weren't his to ask about yet. But on Wednesday evening, he climbed onto the couch beside Riker while Riker was staring at a basketball game he wasn't watching, and Milo pressed his small shoulder into Riker's arm and didn't say anything at all, just sat there. Riker looked down at the top of his son's head. You good? He asked. Mm-hmm. Milo was looking at the TV with the performative interest of someone who did not care about basketball. You good? Yeah. Okay. A beat. Is Sabrina okay? Riker was quiet for a moment. I don't know, bud. Milo absorbed this with the seriousness he brought to most information. Did something happen? Something like that. Is it the kind that gets fixed or the kind that doesn't? Riker looked at the TV. A player made a shot. The crowd responded. The game continued. I don't know yet, he said. Milo nodded. He reached over and grabbed the TV remote and turned the channel to a nature documentary without asking, which was the kind of authority he exercised when he decided the current viewing situation needed improvement. On screen, a blue-footed booby performed an elaborate mating dance on a rock somewhere in the Galapagos. They watched it in silence. That bird, Milo said after a while, is really trying. Riker looked at the screen. The bird was, in fact, really trying. Lifting its vivid blue feet in careful, deliberate sequence, committed fully to the performance regardless of how it looked to outside observers. Yeah, Riker said. It is. He wasn't sure if Milo had meant anything by it. With Milo, you could never be entirely certain. Grant. He wasn't angry in the way he'd expected to be angry. He'd had 2 days now to run back through everything. The coffee shop, the weeks of Tuesday mornings, the lunches, the market, the phone call where she'd said I like it too, the time. And what he kept arriving at wasn't the clean, clear shape of having been lied to. It was something more tangled than that. The facts were the facts. She'd known who she was, and he hadn't, and she'd made the choice every week to keep that gap in place. He couldn't reframe that. He wasn't going to. But the way she'd looked at Milo at the market, the way she'd been on the phone that night when she'd said she was afraid of him looking at her differently, he'd heard something real in that. He knew the difference between a real thing and a performed real thing. He'd spent 4 years watching for performed real things after Claire, and that had been real, which made it worse in some ways and more complicated in others. He thought about Derek Paulson's voice carrying across the ballroom. He'd caught enough of it to understand the context. An experiment, one of her little experiments. He'd stood there holding that and let it sink in, and his first response had been visceral, because it touched something specific in him, the old wound of the person who gets to be someone else's object lesson, someone else's interesting story. He'd been that person before, in a different context, and he'd sworn a long time ago he wouldn't be it again. But then he kept thinking about her face on those steps, and there was nothing performed about that face. She'd been stripped of every professional layer out there in the cold, and what was underneath wasn't someone who'd been running a game. It was someone who had been more afraid than him, possibly, and had made a bad choice out of that fear and then kept making it, and was now standing in the wreckage of it. That didn't fix anything. It was still a mess. He was still angry, not hot angry, just the low, steady ache of someone who'd let himself trust at a speed he usually didn't and paid for it. But it wasn't the simple shape he'd tried to make it on the cab ride home. He didn't call her. She didn't call him. He didn't know what to do with that either. 4 days after the gala, on a Sunday, he came home from a grocery run to find Milo at the kitchen table with his laptop open. This was not unusual. Milo used the laptop for school projects and bird research and the occasional video game that Riker had approved after vetting. What was slightly unusual was the expression on Milo's face, the very focused, very still expression of someone watching something that was holding all of their attention. "What you watching?" Riker asked, putting the grocery bags on the counter. "An interview," Milo said. Riker started unpacking. "For school?" "No." A pause. "It's Sabrina." Riker's hand stopped. He turned slowly. On the screen, clearly pulled from some news archive, the resolution had that slightly compressed quality of older streamed video, was a woman sitting across from an interviewer in what looked like a professional studio. The woman was Sabrina, though younger, maybe 24, 25. Her hair was longer and she was wearing a blazer that was slightly too formal for her, in the way things were too formal when you were young and trying to signal that you belonged somewhere. She looked like someone who had already accomplished things and was still learning to hold them comfortably. "Where did you find that?" Riker asked. His voice came out steady. "I looked her up," Milo said simply. after you said you didn't know if it was the kind that gets fixed. He said this without apology, in the direct way of children who have not yet learned to be embarrassed by their own curiosity. I wanted to know more about her. Riker pulled out the chair next to Milo and sat down. On screen, the interviewer, Tuan Bex, a woman with a notepad, was asking something. Riker caught the end of it. The criticism about whether your early success was built on connections rather than the product itself. How do you respond to that? Young Sabrina on the screen was quiet for a moment. She did the thing Riker had watched her do at the table in the coffee shop, the microassessment, the rapid internal calculation about how much to say. Then she seemed to make a decision. I grew up, she said on screen, being told in 100 different ways that I was too much and not enough simultaneously, too loud, too heavy, too certain, and the response most people expected was for me to shrink, make myself easier to be around. She paused. I never really learned to do that, which meant I got to this point in a straight line, but it was a very lonely straight line. The interviewer leaned in slightly. Lonely how? Every relationship I've had, Sabrina said on screen carefully, has changed the moment the company became real. The money became real. She shook her head. People stop seeing you. They see the number, and once that happens, she stopped. You can't unsee it. You can't go back to the conversation you were having before. That version of the relationship is just gone. The interviewer said something sympathetic. So yeah, Sabrina continued, I've had people tell me I'm hard to love, and I've spent a lot of time believing that, but I think it's more that I'm hard to see clearly. The number gets in the way. She looked directly at the camera for a second, not intentionally, just briefly, and in that second she looked her exact age in a way she usually didn't. I would give a lot, she said, to have one person know me before knowing what I'm worth. The clip ended. Milo looked at his father. Riker was looking at the screen, at the black square where the video had been, at the reflection of the kitchen window in the dark screen. He sat with it for a long moment, the full weight of what he'd just heard, the specific shape of the thing she'd been carrying, the exact architecture of why she'd done what she'd done. She wasn't hiding because she was playing a game. She was hiding because every time she hadn't hidden, she'd lost something. She'd told that to a camera years ago. She'd been carrying it since. She was scared, Milo said. Riker looked at his son. Of the same thing you're scared of, Milo said, with the guileless precision of someone who had not yet learned to soften hard truths. Somebody pretending. Riker was quiet. That's what happened with Mom, Milo said. Not accusingly, just saying the thing. You got scared that people were pretending, and then you stopped. He paused, choosing the word with visible effort. Letting people in. Riker stared at his kid. Milo looked back at him with calm, dark eyes, patient, like he'd been waiting to say this for a while and had simply been waiting for the right moment. How do you know about that? Riker asked. His voice was rough around the edges. Milo shrugged one small shoulder. I listen. To what? You. When you're on the phone with Uncle Pete. When you think I'm asleep. He looked down at the closed laptop. You said once that you were done trusting people who showed you one face and had a different one behind it. He looked up again. Sabrina was doing the same thing, because she was scared of the same thing. Riker put his elbow on the table and pressed his hand over his mouth and looked at his son, this small boy who collected birds and had been paying closer attention than he'd known, and felt something move through him that was complicated and heavy and also, at its bottom, clarifying. He'd been standing on the ballroom steps telling himself she'd used him, kept running the Derek Paulson version of the story through his head because it was cleaner and it let him be the wronged party without any obligation. But that wasn't the whole story. He'd known it wasn't the whole story by the time the cab turned the corner, and he'd chosen not to look at it directly, because looking at it directly meant acknowledging that her fear and his fear were cut from the same cloth. And if that was true, then walking away from her was just another version of the wall he'd been building since Claire. He was so tired of the wall. It had kept things out very effectively. It had also kept things out very effectively. She deserves to know you're not mad about the money, Milo said. You're not, right? It's not about the money. No, Riker said. It was never about the money. Then she doesn't know that. Milo said it simply, as if the logical next step was obvious, because to a 7-year-old it was. You should tell her. Riker looked at the closed laptop, at the dark screen. He thought about every engine he'd ever pulled apart. The principle he'd tried to explain to Milo once, sitting in the shop on a Saturday. The idea that a broken thing was not a useless thing. That the brake told you something about how it worked, and if you understood how it worked, you could fix it. And if you fixed it right, it was sometimes stronger at the brake than it had been before. Milo was watching him with the focused patience of a small person who had made his case and was waiting for the adult to catch up. "When did you get this smart?" Riker asked. Milo considered this. "I think I was just born like this," he said, which was probably true. Mug. Riker drove to Nox Systems headquarters on a Thursday morning. He had not called ahead. He had thought about calling ahead and decided against it, because calling ahead gave the option to redirect, to have someone say she's unavailable, she's in a meeting, let me take a message. He didn't want a message taken. He wanted to stand in front of her and say the things he should have said on those steps. And then he wanted to hear what she said back. And then they were both going to be in the same room with the actual truth of the situation, rather than their separate private versions of it. Nox Systems occupied the top 6 floors of a glass building on 2nd Avenue. He'd driven past it before without knowing. He knew now. He walked into the lobby. It was the kind of lobby that understood exactly what it was communicating. Clean lines, good materials, the hushed certainty of a company that didn't need to announce itself loudly because the building did it for them. A reception desk, a security panel, a young man in a blue blazer who looked up with the professional pleasantness of someone whose job was to manage the boundary between the world and the floors above it. "I'm here to see Sabrina Nox," Riker said. The young man's expression did not change, exactly, but something in it shifted into the particular register of someone applying a filter. "Do you have an appointment?" "No?" "Ms. Nox's schedule is... I know she doesn't have me on the calendar. Can you tell her Riker Hale is in the lobby?" A brief assessment. "What's this regarding?" He thought about how to answer that. "Tell her it's regarding something I should have said 4 days ago." The young man looked at him for a second, then picked up the phone. Riker waited. He stood in the lobby of her building and looked at the city through the glass and breathed. He wasn't nervous in the way he'd expected to be nervous. He was steady, which surprised him slightly. He felt the way he felt at the start of a difficult job, not relaxed, but settled, clear about what needed doing. Above him, 32 floors up, something was happening that he couldn't see. What was happening was that Priya had knocked on Sabrina's office door and opened it with the expression that meant she was delivering something that required careful handling. "There's a Riker Hale in the lobby," she said. "He says it's about something he should have said 4 days ago." Sabrina, who had been staring at a contract revision without reading it for approximately 40 minutes, went very still. "He's here," she said. "Lobby level, front desk." Priya's voice was entirely professionally neutral. Her face was not. Sabrina stood up, sat back down, stood back up. "You're going down there," Priya said. "I know." Or you could have him come up. She thought about that. About him stepping off the elevator into the corridors of Nox Systems, into the full official context of everything she was here. She thought about the lobby of the ballroom, about the way the room had reorganized itself around her identity the moment they walked through the door, about how that had gone. "I'll go down," she said. She took the elevator. 32 floors of watching the numbers descend. She'd ridden this elevator 10,000 times. This was the only time she'd been aware of each individual floor. The doors opened. He was standing near the center of the lobby with his hands loose at his sides, in his canvas jacket and work boots, and he looked exactly like himself, not dressed for this building, not trying to be, just standing there like a person who had a reason for being somewhere and was comfortable with that reason. He saw her. She crossed the lobby. They stopped a few feet apart. Neither of them said anything for a second. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. He looked at her with that steady, direct look she'd learned was just how he looked at things he was taking seriously. "I was wrong about some of it," he said. "Not all of it. You should have told me sooner. That part I'm sticking with." She held his gaze. "You're right about that part. But the other thing..." He stopped. ran a hand over his jaw the way he did when he was choosing words carefully. What those people said at the gala, I let that in too fast. I let it tell me a story about you that I already knew wasn't the whole story. He paused. I was looking for a reason to step back, because stepping back is something I'm good at. She didn't fill the silence. I watched a video this morning, he said. Old interview. My son found it. He met her eyes. I heard what you said about the number, about what it does to things. A beat. I'm not scared of the number, Sabrina. I want you to know that. That's not what it was. Something behind her sternum released slightly. I was scared, he said, that I was something you were doing, not something you actually... He stopped. I've been that before. To someone. The person who was convenient and useful and not quite real. He said it flat, without self-pity, just naming it the way he named facts. I was scared that's what I was to you. She shook her head. You were the only real thing I had going, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. The only place I was just a person. I protected it badly. I should have been honest, but it was real. He looked at her for a long moment. The lobby moved around them. A man crossing with a briefcase, someone exiting through the glass doors. The ordinary business of a building that didn't know or care about the conversation in its center. I need you to not hide from me again, he said. Whatever else. I need to know who I'm talking to. Yes, she said. No hesitation. And I need... He paused again. I'm not easy. I want you to know that. I have a kid and a job that smells like diesel, and I'm not going to suddenly become someone who fits in that room you were in the other night. I don't want you to fit in that room, she said. I'm serious. So am I. She took a breath. Riker, I didn't fall for you because you fit somewhere. I fell for you because you sat down. He was quiet. In the coffee shop, she said. You sat down, and you didn't want anything, and I have been... She stopped, steadied herself. I have been waiting for that for a very long time. Something in his face shifted. The guardedness didn't disappear. It wasn't the kind that disappeared completely, and she understood that because hers didn't either. But it moved, made room for something else. He looked at the floor for a second, then back at her. I have an apology to make, he said. A real one. Not just to you. She tilted her head. I walked away on those steps, he said. In front of your people. In your space. His jaw was tight again, but differently. This was the tight of someone holding themselves accountable rather than holding someone else off. That wasn't... I don't do that. That's not how I handle things, and it wasn't fair. She opened her mouth. Let me finish, he said. I need to say it right. He looked at her directly. I defended you in a coffee shop because you deserved it. That part was easy. The harder part... He let out a slow breath. The harder part is showing up when it's inconvenient, when it costs me something, when I'm hurt and I want to walk. He met her eyes. I'm here. That's me showing up. She stood in her lobby and looked at this man who fixed broken engines for a living and raised a boy who listened to bluebirds on back fences, who said things plainly when he wanted to say them, and who had just driven to her building without calling ahead because he had something to say and he'd decided it needed to be said in person. And she felt something that was not sophisticated or complicated or useful for any professional purpose she could name. She just felt it, straight through, no filter. Milo would want to know, she said carefully, that I found a stellar jay feather last week, near Volunteer Park. I didn't know what to do with it. Something in his face changed entirely. That boy, he said, is going to lose his mind. I kept it, she said, in my desk. I wasn't sure if he'd want it. Riker shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, just in the way of someone recalibrating around new information. He's going to want it, he said. He's going to want to know every detail of where you found it, and what time of day and what direction you were walking. I know the details, she said. A small silence. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. It wasn't repaired. Not in this lobby, not in this conversation. There were things that needed more time and more honesty, and probably more discomfort before they were fully what they could be. They both knew this. They were both, at their cores, People who understood that things worth having didn't come clean and simple. But he was here. And she was here. And for the first time since those steps in the cold, she felt the tight thing in her chest loosen more than just around the edges. Outside, through the glass walls of the lobby, Seattle went about its gray November business. People crossing the street, someone with a coffee, a courier on a bike cutting between cars. Ordinary life, moving at its ordinary speed, indifferent and continuous. Inside, two imperfect people stood in a lobby and looked at each other and didn't look away. That was enough, for now. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The stellar J. Feather sat on Milo's desk for 3 weeks before he decided it was too important to keep there. He moved it to his field journal, pressed carefully between 2 pages of wax paper he'd asked Riker to help him cut, tucked between his entry for the varied thrush, and a drawing he'd made of a great blue heron that was anatomically ambitious, if not entirely accurate. He'd written underneath it, in his careful 7-year-old handwriting, Stellar J. Feather, found Volunteer Park, found by Sabrina. He'd underlined Sabrina's name twice, which Riker noticed and did not comment on. Things after the lobby conversation were not immediately simple. They weren't supposed to be. Both of them understood this without discussing it, which was itself a form of progress. They'd stopped pretending to each other that things were easier than they were, and that honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, was the ground they were building on now. They talked more. Properly. The kind of talking that had been happening around the edges before, careful, partial, strategically edited, opened up into something wider. She told him about the acquisition that had failed 3 years ago, the one that had cost her 2 board members and 6 months of sleep and had been written about in the business press in ways that had required her to develop a very specific relationship with not reading her own coverage. He told her about Claire. He did this on a Saturday afternoon in November, sitting in his kitchen while Milo was at a friend's house, with coffee going cold on the table between them because neither of them was drinking it. Claire had been his wife. They'd met at 24, married at 26, had Milo at 28, and by 30 were 2 people sharing a house who had gradually stopped being honest about what they needed until the distance between them had grown too large to cross. Without a fight, neither of them wanted to have. She hadn't been a bad person. He'd said that clearly. She wasn't a villain in the story. She was someone who had wanted a different life than the one they'd built, and had been unable to say so directly until the gap was unfixable. And by the time she left, Milo was 4, and Riker had spent 2 years running silent diagnostics on a marriage he hadn't understood was failing. The worst part, he said, wasn't that she left. It was that I couldn't find where it had broken. I went back through everything, and I couldn't find the specific thing. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. With an engine, there's always a point, a specific failure. You find it, you fix it, you know what to watch for next time. He looked at the table. With her, I never found it, and for a long time that meant I was afraid to let anything get close enough to break again. Sabrina was quiet. Milo was the thing that made it okay, he said. Not easy, but okay. Because the job was clear. He needed things, and I provided them, and that was a system I understood. He looked up at her. You complicated the system. Sorry, she said. Don't be. He said it immediately, without hesitation. I needed the system complicated. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. I've been thinking about what you said, in the lobby, about showing up when it costs you something. Yeah. I haven't been good at that. She said it without softening. Direct, the way she was direct in board meetings, the way she was direct about everything except the personal things she'd been hiding in plain sight. I'm very good at building things. But I build them and then I protect them. I wall them off. I don't let people near the thing I've actually made because the thing I've actually made is the only place I feel safe. And if someone damages it, then you lose the one safe thing, he said. Yes. So you protect it by never letting anyone in, which means it stays safe and also completely empty. She let out a breath. I know, I've known for a while. It's easier to know things than to change them. He looked at her for a moment. You let Milo in, he said. First day at the coffee shop, practically. You held his hand at the market. She looked at the table. He didn't give me a choice. She almost smiled. He just took my hand. He didn't ask. He does that, Riker said. He decides you're safe, and then he treats it as settled. He's always been that way. He's smarter than both of us, she said. Significantly, Riker agreed. They sat in the kitchen in the gray November afternoon and drank their cold coffee and talked for 2 more hours. Nothing was resolved in the way resolutions happened in stories. Neat, final, clearly marked. What happened was more ordinary and more lasting than that. 2 people decided, without ceremony, to stop protecting themselves from each other. It wasn't a moment. It was a direction. December came, and with it the particular Seattle winter that wasn't about snow so much as a specific quality of darkness and rain that settled over the city like a long exhale. The days were short, the nights were long. Milo added 4 more birds to his journal, a pine siskin, 2 dark-eyed juncos, and something that Riker insisted was a house sparrow, and that Milo insisted, with supporting photographic evidence, was a Eurasian tree sparrow, which was significantly rarer and more interesting, and which turned out after a very thorough investigation to be, in fact, a Eurasian tree sparrow. Riker conceded the point. Milo documented his victory in the journal with a small gold star sticker. Sabrina came to dinner for the first time in early December. It was not a big dinner. Riker made chili, real chili, not from a can, the kind he'd been making since his uncle taught him in the Spokane kitchen when he was 16. It was, objectively, very good chili. He was not going to say this himself, but Milo said it for him. "My dad's chili is the best I've ever had," Milo announced, with the authority of someone whose chili sample size was limited, but whose conviction was total. "It's very good," Sabrina agreed, which was an understatement. "I told him to make it fancier for you," Milo said, "because you're rich, but he said good food doesn't need to be fancier, it just needs to be right." Riker closed his eyes briefly. Sabrina looked at him over the rim of her bowl. "He's not wrong," she said. "I know," Riker said. "Thank you. Please don't encourage him to quote me." "I'm writing it in my journal," Milo said, and appeared to be doing exactly that, having produced the field journal from somewhere and begun documenting, presumably, Riker's culinary philosophy. After dinner, while Riker cleaned up, Milo showed Sabrina his full bird list, all 23 entries now, each with a stamp, each with notes in his careful handwriting. He explained the Eurasian tree sparrow situation in full. He showed her the stellar jay feather between its wax paper pages. He told her about his theory, which he'd been developing since October, that the birds that came to their back fence were the same specific birds returning, not random different birds, and that they had a system of visitation that he was still mapping. "That's actually a real thing," Sabrina said. "Birds have territories. They do return to the same places." Milo looked at her with the pure satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed by an adult. "I knew it," he said. "You should document the times," she said, "and the weather conditions. If you track it long enough, you might see a pattern." He stared at her. "Can you help me make a chart?" "Yeah," she said, "I can do that." From the kitchen, over the sound of running water and dishes, Riker listened to his son and Sabrina design a bird observation chart at the kitchen table, Milo's voice rising and falling with enthusiasm, Sabrina asking questions that were specific enough to show she was paying real attention. He stood at the sink with the warm water running over his hands and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. It wasn't perfect. He wasn't going to tell himself it was perfect. There were things to navigate still. The gap in their worlds was real, not something you dissolved by wanting to. She had a life that operated at a scale he had never inhabited, and he had a life whose demands were specific and physical and daily, and the overlap was not automatic. They were going to have to build the overlap deliberately, which was more work than the version where things just fit. But Milo was showing her his journal page by page, and she was looking at each one with genuine attention, and the kitchen smelled like chili and dish soap, and outside the December rain came down steady and even against the windows. He dried his hands and went back to the table. January brought the Knox Systems Foundation announcement. Sabrina had been developing the concept since before the gala, quietly, in the margins of her regular work, in early morning hours and late evening notes that Priya had started calling the Parallel Project. It was a national foundation focused on three things: confidence-building programs for adolescents, anti-bullying resources for schools, and accessible mental health support for communities that didn't have it. The kind of foundation that came from a specific place, not a PR exercise, not a tax strategy. The kind that came from having been a heavy kid in Portland who learned to protect herself by building things, and who understood at a cellular level what it cost to grow up in a room that was laughing. She announced it at a press conference in mid-January. Riker watched it on his phone in the shop during his lunch break, sitting on an overturned crate with a sandwich in one hand and his phone propped against a toolbox. The feed was slightly delayed, and his phone screen had a crack across the upper corner that made the image fragment slightly along one edge. And none of this mattered because he was watching her stand at a podium in front of a room full of cameras and journalists and say, plainly and without the careful corporate distance she usually kept at these things, "I built this company from a studio apartment and a credit card I shouldn't have maxed out. I built it because I was a kid who got told she was too much, and I decided to do something with all that too much." She looked at the room directly. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that building something for yourself and building something that reaches back, those aren't the same thing. This foundation is me trying to close that gap." Dennis appeared beside him, looked at the phone, looked at Riker. "That your girl?" Riker looked at Dennis. "Yeah." Dennis nodded slowly, the nod of a 63-year-old man who had developed a philosophy about most things. "She did good," he said, and walked back to his workbench. Riker ate his sandwich and watched the rest of the press conference and thought that Dennis was not wrong. She called him that evening. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who had spent a full day performing composure and was now, in private, allowing themselves to simply be tired. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good, I think. The coverage is... I don't read my own coverage." "Smart. Priya reads it and gives me a summary. The summary is good." "Then it went well." A pause. "I was nervous," she said, "which I wasn't expecting. I've done hundreds of these." "This one was different," he said. "Yeah." Her voice was quiet. "This one was mine." He understood what she meant. The difference between the thing you do for the company and the thing you do because it came from somewhere in you that doesn't have a business case. The thing that's yours, that you're putting out into the world without the protection of a strategy or a metric. That was terrifying in a specific way that professional success wasn't. "You did good," he said, using Dennis's words, not because he'd planned to, but because they were right. She was quiet for a moment. "Riker." "Yeah." "Thank you for coming back." She said it simply, without performance. "In the lobby. You didn't have to do that either." "And you did." He thought about the ballroom steps, about the cab ride, about Milo on the couch with his shoulder pressed against his arm, and the nature documentary, and the blue-footed booby really trying. "Yeah, well," he said, "I had some good advice." "From who?" 7-year-old I know, very perceptive kid. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I owe him a bird chart. He's been asking about it. Tell him Saturday. He'll hold you to that." "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." Spring arrived the way Seattle springs arrived. Not dramatically, not with a clear date of transition, but gradually, incrementally, the light shifting by minutes each day until one morning you stepped outside and realized the quality of the air had changed. February became March. The days lengthened. Milo's bird observation chart had 16 weeks of data, and he had, in fact, identified a pattern. 3 specific birds that returned to the back fence with a consistency that bordered on reliable, which he'd marked on the chart with a system of colored dots that Sabrina had suggested and that had evolved well beyond her original proposal into something that looked like genuine field research methodology. "This kid should be a scientist," Sabrina told Riker, standing at the kitchen counter looking at the chart spread across the table. "He's 7, Riker said. "Some people know early. He also wants to be a truck driver, a marine biologist, and a professional kettle corn taster. He's keeping his options open." "Smart," Sabrina said. "Diversified portfolio." Milo from the other room shouted, "I heard that, and I'm still adding astronomer to the list." Riker and Sabrina looked at each other. "He hears everything," Riker said. "I know," she said. "It's terrifying and wonderful." She had been part of the house's rhythm by March in the way that happened not through a single decision, but through accumulated presence. She didn't live there. Her apartment was her space, and she needed her space, and Riker understood this without it needing to be negotiated. But she was there for dinners on Thursdays, sometimes Saturdays. She was the person Milo texted with bird findings when Riker's phone was out of reach. She was in the rotation of people who could pick Milo up from school on the rare occasions when Riker got caught in a job that ran late, which she had done twice and which Milo had declared both times excellent because she let him choose the after-school snack without editorial comment. She was also navigating, in parallel, the particular challenge of having a public life and a private one that kept brushing against each other. The Foundation coverage had included, eventually, a reference to her personal life, vague, sourced from somewhere she couldn't identify, the kind of paragraph that said she had been seen around Seattle with a companion who was described as a local tradesman, which was the kind of language that was technically not wrong, and also managed to be condescending in exactly 12 words. She'd told him about it directly, which was progress, and he'd read it and shrugged in the way of someone who had decided the opinion of journalists about his occupation was not his problem. Tradesman, he'd said, flat. They meant it as, I know what they meant it as. He handed her phone back. I fix diesel engines. That's an honest job. I'm not going to be embarrassed about it because someone in a newsroom thinks the word tradesman is clever. She looked at him. You okay? He asked. I'm fine, she said. I was worried about how you'd feel about it. I feel fine about it. He picked up his coffee. Do you feel fine about it? She thought about that. I feel fine about what we are, she said. I feel annoyed about the way it gets framed. Then feel annoyed about the framing and fine about us. He said it practically, like it was simple math. Those are different things. She nodded slowly. You're very rational about this. I fix things for a living. I find rational useful. She had kept that exchange in her head for a while after. The ease of it. The way he'd taken the thing that she'd been anxious about and separated it into its actual components. The thing that mattered and the thing that didn't. Without diminishing her annoyance or inflating it into something larger than it was. That was a skill, she'd come to understand. Not a natural quality exactly, but something he developed through the same process he'd developed all his skills. By doing difficult work, repeatedly, until it became reliable. She'd been trying to learn it. She was better at it than she'd been in October. Not good. Better. The Knox Foundation's first real program launched in April, a pilot confidence and leadership curriculum in 5 Seattle public schools, running through the end of the school year. Sabrina was involved at a level that was probably more operational than a CEO should be for a foundation program, but she'd never been good at delegated distance for things she actually cared about. She visited 2 of the schools in the first week. The second school was Milo's. This was not planned. She'd known his school was in the pilot group, it was in the right district, met the criteria, had an enthusiastic vice principal who'd responded to the outreach email within 4 hours. She hadn't flagged it to Riker because it hadn't occurred to her to see it as a conflict, and also, honestly, because she'd wanted to see it. She was in the gymnasium with the program coordinator watching 8-year-olds practice a presentation exercise when she heard a familiar voice from across the room. That's Sabrina. She looked up. Milo was standing at the gymnasium door with his class, in a line, wearing his slightly too large rain jacket with the Audubon Society patch, pointing at her with the directional certainty of someone identifying a rare bird. His teacher looked uncertain. You know her? Yes, Milo said with complete confidence. She helps me track birds. Sabrina raised a hand. Milo raised a hand back. His teacher spent the rest of the visit slightly off balance, trying to recalibrate the relationship between the woman from the foundation and the boy in the third row who kept adding details to the official presentation with his own supplementary commentary. On the drive back to the office, Sabrina sat in the back of the car and did something she didn't do often. She called her mother. They talked for 20 minutes, which was longer than their calls usually ran. She told her about the foundation, about the schools. She mentioned, not as a main topic but woven in, Riker and Milo. Her mother, who was a practical woman who had spent 30 years watching her daughter build walls and live inside them, listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual. When Sabrina finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The boy sounds like a good one." "Which one?" "Both," her mother said. "But I meant the little one." A pause. "He just took your hand?" "Yeah," Sabrina said. "Kids know," her mother said. Not profoundly, just stating it the way you stated things that were simply true. Sabrina looked out the window at the April city, the first real color after months of gray, the trees along 2nd Avenue budding in pale green, the kind of morning that made Seattle look like it had been saving this for months and was finally ready to spend it. "Mom," she said. "Yeah, I think I'm happy." Her mother was quiet for a second, then, "I know, I can hear it." Another pause. "Don't mess it up." "Working on it," Sabrina said. "Good girl," her mother said, which was not something Sabrina needed to hear at 30 years old, and also was, in that moment, exactly what she needed to hear. The Summer Festival was Sabrina's Foundation's largest fundraising event, a one-day outdoor festival in Volunteer Park, sponsored by Knox Systems, free admission, built around community and family programming. Food vendors, live music, children's activities, a resource fair with mental health and youth services organizations. It had been in planning since February. Priya had managed the logistics with the focused intensity of someone who treated event planning as a military operation. Sabrina had been involved in approximately every decision, from the vendor selection to the stage layout to the color of the banners, which Priya said was too much involvement and Sabrina said was appropriate involvement, and the banners turned out well, so the point was technically unresolved. It was a Saturday in late July. Seattle gave them a perfect day, the kind of day the city held in reserve for occasions when it needed to prove it deserved to exist. Blue sky, warm without being hot, the lake visible from the high point of the park, shining flat and bright in the afternoon light. By noon, several thousand people had come through. By 2 o'clock, it was the largest event the foundation had put on. Riker was there, not as a guest, not as a companion, but as something more integrated than either. He'd been helping with the community project component since March, a partnership with 2 local vocational programs that the foundation had funded, one of which was a diesel and fleet mechanics training program for young adults aging out of foster care. He'd connected the dots between the program and Ballard Diesel, had talked to Dennis, who had agreed with characteristic abruptness to take on 2 apprentices per cycle. Riker had been running the mentorship side of it for 3 months, and he was good at it, in the specific way that people were good at things that drew on what they'd actually learned rather than what they'd studied. At the festival, the vocational program had a booth. Riker was there for part of the afternoon, talking with 2 of his current apprentices and with a group of teenagers who'd come with a youth center from Rainier Valley. He was not performing anything. He was just explaining how engines worked, which was what he did when he was in his element, clear and direct and engaged in a way that was different from social engagement, more natural, the way everyone was better at being themselves inside the thing they actually knew. Sabrina watched him from across the festival grounds at one point, just for a moment while she was between conversations. She watched him crouch down to explain something at a display, watched one of the teenagers lean in, watched Riker respond with the patience he had for people who were learning as opposed to people who were wasting his time, which required 2 completely different modes that he deployed without appearing to switch between them. She thought about the coffee shop in October, the man with the canvas jacket and the grease-stained fingers who'd sat down across from her without a plan, just because he thought it was the right thing to do. She thought about everything that had happened since, the Tuesdays and the lunches and the gala steps and the lobby and the dinner and the bird charts and the chili and the long, honest conversations in the kitchen. The imperfect, difficult, genuine accumulation of 2 people deciding to be real with each other. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known in October, that being seen was not the same thing as being known. That being known required you to be knowable, which required you to stop managing your own presentation 24 hours a day. She hadn't been able to do that for anyone in 6 years. She'd built a company that was extraordinary and a life that was sealed, and she told herself the sealed life was the cost of the extraordinary company, which was a story that was easier than the truth. The truth was simpler. The truth was that she'd been afraid, and fear was a very good architect, and the house it had built for her was beautiful and completely empty. Not anymore. Not since a mechanic sat down. Milo appeared beside her. He'd been running around the festival for most of the afternoon with a clipboard, conducting what he'd told her this morning was a field survey, which appeared to involve noting every bird he spotted in the park and their GPS coordinates, estimated, which he was tracking using a method he'd developed himself involving the park map and a pencil. He had 6 entries so far and looked extremely satisfied. "I found a cedar waxwing," he said. "Where?" "Near the north edge, by the big Doug fir." He showed her the clipboard. The entry was meticulous: time, location reference, weather conditions, direction of flight. He'd drawn a small sketch. "That's a good find," she said. "They don't come down often." "I know." He closed the clipboard with the efficient satisfaction of a field researcher completing a data entry. He looked at the festival around them. The crowds, the music, the afternoon light, his father across the grounds, in conversation. "This is a good day," he said. It was not a complicated statement. It was just a 7-year-old telling the truth about a day. "Yeah," Sabrina said. "It really is." He slid his hand into hers, same as the market in October. No announcement, no ceremony, just a small hand finding hers and holding on, because that was what you did with people you'd decided were safe. She held on back. The proposal happened at 4 in the afternoon, which was not a time anyone would have scripted for it. Sabrina was on the main stage, wrapping up a brief address to the crowd. A few minutes about the foundation's first year, what had been built, where it was going. She was comfortable on stage now, in the way she was comfortable in boardrooms, which was to say she was there, fully, with all of it. She finished her remarks. The crowd applauded. She was stepping back from the podium when the MC, a woman from the Foundation's communications team, said, "Actually, I think we have one more thing." And Sabrina turned and Riker was there. He had come from the side of the stage. He was in a blue shirt she hadn't seen before, and he looked like himself, not dressed for a different occasion, not performing a different version, just himself, in a blue shirt, walking toward her in front of a few thousand people with the specific focused quality he brought to things that mattered. She understood what was happening about 2 seconds before it happened. Her hand went to her mouth. He stopped in front of her. He didn't have a speech prepared. She would find out later that he'd thought about a speech and decided against it, because he didn't do things he didn't mean, and he wasn't going to manufacture words for the sake of the occasion. He was going to say the real thing. Milo had walked onto the stage behind him, holding a small bunch of sunflowers that were slightly lopsided in the way flowers were when a child carried them. And he stood just behind his father's shoulder with the air of someone who had been let in on this plan and had been extremely serious about maintaining operational secrecy. Riker looked at her. "I defended you because you deserved it," he said. His voice was steady, carrying to the crowd without him trying to make it carry, just the natural projection of someone who was used to being heard over engines. "I stayed because you made me happy, and I came back—" A brief pause, just a breath, just a moment of a man feeling the weight of what he was saying. "I came back because I love you." He reached into his jacket pocket. He got down on one knee. The crowd was completely still. She was already crying before he finished, not the composed kind, the kind that arrived before you could manage it, because the feeling was faster than the defense, and for once in her life the defense had shown up too late, and she was glad. "Sabrina Knox," he said, looking up at her. "You are the most complicated, careful, occasionally infuriating, genuinely remarkable person I have ever sat across a table from." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, something more real than a smile. "Will you marry me?" She said yes. Not after a pause, not after collecting herself. She said it immediately, completely, the way she made the decisions she was most certain about, without hesitation and without looking for the angle. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He stood up and she stepped forward and they were together in the way that was not graceful or cinematic but was entirely real. His arms around her, her face against his shoulder, the slight awkward bump of the ring box still in his hand. The crowd responded with the full, warm, uncomplicated noise of people who had witnessed something true and were glad for it. Milo stepped forward with his sunflowers. Sabrina pulled back from Riker enough to look at the boy. His face was doing approximately 17 things at once, proud, delighted, trying very hard to look calm about it, failing completely at looking calm about it. She took the sunflowers. "You knew," she said. "For 2 weeks," he said. "It was very hard not to tell you. I almost told you 4 times. What stopped you?" He considered this seriously. "I wrote it in my journal," he said. "Instead." That helped. She looked at him, this boy who had taken her hand at the market and stamped bird shapes in a field journal and tracked cedar waxwings at GPS coordinates estimated with a pencil, this boy who had shown her the interview and who had held his father accountable with the guileless precision of someone who loved without strategy. She crouched down in front of him. "Hey," she said. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Is this okay? With you?" He looked at her with his direct, unhurried eyes. The eyes that saw things and filed them and understood more than they were supposed to at this age. Then he said very simply, "I wanted this before you did." She laughed. She couldn't help it. It broke out of her completely, the genuine kind, and Riker above her made a sound that was also a laugh, and Milo looked satisfied in the way of someone who had delivered the correct answer to an important question. She wrapped her arms around him, sunflowers and all. He hugged her back with both arms, the full committed hug of a child who didn't do things halfway. "Now we're finally a real team," he said into her shoulder. She held on. Here is what the story is, underneath all of it. It is a story about 2 people who were both, in their different ways, hiding. Not from each other specifically, from the thing that kept happening when they let people get close. The recalibration. The moment when the person in front of you stops seeing you and starts seeing the version of you that's useful to them. Riker had experienced this in a marriage that failed quietly, in the specific way that quiet failures are sometimes worse than loud ones. Sabrina had experienced it every time the number entered the conversation. They had each, independently, built structures to prevent it from happening again. Good structures, solid construction, nothing obviously wrong with them, except that the structures also kept out everything else. This is the thing nobody tells you about self-protection, because it is not a comfortable thing to say. The wall that keeps the bad things out is the same wall. It does not distinguish. It keeps out the person who will use you and the person who will love you with equal efficiency, because it is a wall and not an intelligence, and walls do not have judgment. Taking it down is terrifying. It requires you to believe without guarantees that the person on the other side is actually who they appear to be. You cannot know this for certain. You can only decide to trust it and accept the risk, and the risk is real, and some people get it wrong, and the only alternative is the sealed house, which is safe and empty. Riker chose the risk first, at a table in a coffee shop when he sat down across from a stranger because it was the right thing to do, without expectation of return. That was who he was at his best. The man who showed up because something needed doing. Sabrina chose it slower, the way she did most things, carefully, calculatingly, and then all at once. The moment she stopped calculating and just held a child's hand in a crowded market. The moment she said yes on a stage in a park in July. Because the feeling was faster than the defense. Milo, who was 7 and therefore not interested in protecting himself from things that seemed good, had known from the beginning. There is a version of this story where the fear wins, where Riker stays on the ballroom steps and doesn't come back, where Sabrina never goes back to the coffee shop on those Tuesdays, where both of them remain inside their structures, which are good structures, well built, that would have served them fine for years. And fine is not the same as alive. They chose alive. It cost them something. Trust, pride, the comfortable distance they'd both been maintaining from their own vulnerabilities. It was not smooth, it was not clean. There were conversations that were hard, and silences that were long, and moments when both of them wanted to retreat to the safer version of themselves. But there was also chilly on a December night, and a boy with a field journal and a stellar jay feather between pages of wax paper. There were Tuesday mornings and bird charts, and a foundation that grew from a personal scar into something that reached back. There were 3 people at a kitchen table figuring out the logistics of a life together, making it up as they went, getting some of it wrong, getting enough of it right. The team, as Milo had declared it. Finally, a real team. In the end, if you're looking for what this story is about, it's about this. The most important thing you will ever do is not the company you build, or the title you hold, or the number that gets attached to your name. It is the moment you decide to sit down across from someone, without expectation, without angle, without the protection of a careful presentation. It is the moment you decide that being known is worth the risk of being known. That is the whole thing. Everything else follows from that.